Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Fin TV. Today, I've got a special guest, Vince Mozik. Vince, you've got a lot of roles, so why don't I probably just leave it to you to introduce yourself a little bit, tell us who you are, and give us your background.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm enjoying to share some of my supply chain experience with everyone. As far as my background, I have over 15 years of supply chain experience. I've been fortunate to work at many different Fortune 500 companies. My background's undergraduates from Western Michigan in supply chain. In early 2000, I graduated, and then I worked at during my role there, I worked at Mitsubishi Motors, Marathon, General Electric, and then electronics company, Jabil Circuit, and then in automotive around the Detroit area near the recession time. So when everything, we had some challenges with the recession, I moved down to Dallas. I currently live in Dallas for the past 11 years. Upon that, I work in the aerospace industry. So I worked at a company called Parker Hannifin, which is a very large conglomerate. I was a strategic commodity manager. And then my last role for the past 8 years has been at a company that was a subsidiary of Boeing called Aviall, and then Boeing, now it's fully integrated with Boeing. So I've been a demand planning leader there for the last couple of years. And then also outside of corporate world, I've been teaching at the University of Texas at Dallas, supply chain undergraduate course I'm starting my 6th semester now, so I really enjoy that. It's really nice to give back to the younger future leaders in supply chain. And then I've been teaching APICS certifications for the last couple of years as well. So I think the last couple of years I realized that I have a passion to share the best practices of supply chain. And I've been able to try to find a way to weave my, to allocate my time accordingly. So
well, that makes sense. It certainly keeps you busy, I bet.
Yeah, it does. And I really, I do enjoy it. And I've learned a lot about time management. I think I look at my time a lot differently than when I was just working at a company and didn't have any other extracurricular responsibilities. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, why don't we get started on maybe talking to me about, you say you've got a passion for the future generation of supply chain leaders. How do you think that the role has evolved since you've started to maybe, what you expect the new leaders to look like?
Sure. Well, I think that's a really good question. And what I realized is what drove me into supply chain is, I knew I wanted to work in business, and I've always been interested in how companies really operate, right? So with that, one would tend to, in supply chain, we're in the middle or we're the midst of all the chaos that happens at companies. I think years ago, it was broken down between, either if you're going to be in supply chain, you're going to work in logistics, planning or purchasing, right? So now there's so much, as we all know, there's so much physical and digital connections and technology based where the future position in supply chain is someone has to be a lot more comfortable and aware of how automation is important and how, the soft skills can be really utilized. So, the best people in supply chain are always very creative and want to solve problems. And they're always not afraid to understand processes and handoffs. So I really always, those that have the general problem solving capabilities will seem to do pretty well in supply chain. So.
Do you think maybe supply chain leaders kind of thrive on crisis and I guess do really well in these kinds of environments?
I think the best supply chain, there's in big companies, they expedite and it's all about, let's make things happen for the customer. But those that can take a step back and understand what's broken in processes to fix things are those that are really able to drive value with the company. So, with that being said, I think most people in supply chain, they look into Six Sigma and process improvement activities because there's such a nice complement of always trying to do things, more effective and, that are, can streamline operations. So I don't know if did that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, I think the when you look at the genetic makeup to some degree of people in supply chain, or coupled with the nature of the job itself, you're absolutely right. You've hit upon, creative solution, focused people that are trying to find what's broken, fix it. So I guess let's go straight into what's happening right now with COVID-19.
Sure.
What kind of lessons can we learn from a crisis like this?
Yeah. Sure. So I think, everyone's been suspect around forecasting the last, 10 years, and people always say on in best case forecast accuracy is 68%, correct, right? So with that, there's so much focus on demand driven
Hmm.
methodologies. And I think with respect to what's going on right now, companies are really realizing that um, we can't put a significant amount of attention around forecasts. We really have to get close to the customers as much as possible and really understand the consumption rate so we can become more demand driven. So like really breaking down that horizon and trying to, there's a decoupling point that happens in supply chain. So what that really means is how we move from a push system to a pull system. So a lot of companies are really important to that. But another thing that COVID, I think, really taught a lot of industries. I know in the aerospace industry, there's no, those that have been reading the news, there's significant decrease in demand with respect to commercial travel. So a lot of companies, look at, they want to always, say, hey, we got risk mitigation plans in place and we look at probability, but I think it's going to force companies to require a lot more attention to that, because it's going to make it more difficult for companies because they're always trying to, fight through their targets for the quarter and do things with that. So going back to your initial question, I mean, supply chain leaders have to be extremely dynamic. They can't be afraid to learn as they go. And COVID is always, it's just making professionals and companies always trying to find a way to innovate and really not get too comfortable. Because if you have the core customer base, that could change very quickly, right? Which we're seeing right now, and every industry is going through this. So I think it's going to make everyone stronger. I know it's going to make me stronger, and all we can do is worry about what we can control, and then just try to put it into our tool set in the future.
And we do have plenty of tool sets that we can take into consideration. Can I talk to you briefly about digital transformation? I mean, pre-COVID, it was what we were all talking about: digital transformation, digitization. It kind of means different things for different people.
Yeah.
What does it mean to you?
Sure. So when we think about digitization, it's all about having end-to-end visibility of the movement of goods. And really, it's about how do we automate repetitive tasks? So what companies, all big companies right now, they're really trying to figure out, how do we automate these repetitive tasks? And how do we make the new supply chain leader not do the mundane things, but do more of the complex work, right? So, with that becomes bots that can create purchase orders or things related to that. So when we think about digitization, a real simple way to think about it, that I like to use in my class is we think about, we all used Uber before, right? When we order things on, we order a vehicle on Uber, we can see how that vehicle's moving within, to us. So that's one piece of having that total level of transparency and visibility that really helps people understand. And it's just really embracing the technology piece a lot more. I think, when we think about digitization, that some of the things that come up is like Internet of Things. That's going to be a game changer. I'm a big believer of blockchain. There was just a great article in the Harvard Business Review last month that really touched on the importance of blockchain. And, a lot of these, technologies are being looked at and assessed, and there's no silver bullet. I think it's just a matter of how companies can really understand what's out there and really not be afraid to spend money on things, because and try things to do things faster and smarter. So digitization is definitely critical, right?
But we definitely don't want to digitize for digitization's sake. And I think some companies have been guilty of doing that. The whole idea now post-COVID, or I guess during COVID, is those companies that have not embraced digital transformation really need to get onto that, don't they? In terms of implementing digital. What do you think about the prospects of attracting millennials, younger people, diverse people from different backgrounds to supply chain? Do you think that there's an opportunity now to attract those kinds of people?
Yeah, I think there's been more. I think the one silver lining that we've seen in this crisis is supply chain is getting a lot more attention. So we're hearing, it's a very common term now in the news. The word supply chain, we've heard this many before, that people say it should be called supply chain, maybe demand network, and maybe something more, customer value chain facing. I think it's getting a tremendous amount of attention, because if you really break down with the millennials to say, okay, you want to work in business, and these are how companies make money. And most companies sit around the, 8 to 15% margin activities. And if you can really show them to say, if you can do good things on procurement from a strategic sourcing or negotiation perspective, you can drive bottom line. And how rewarding is that, where you know, someone out of college is making a set salary, but they can really articulate how they save the company tremendous amount of money. I think there's so much, you know, interest for that. So I think it's just naturally, it's going to take a lot of, it's starting to move in the right direction. It always amazes me today that supply chain's not as well recognized as it needs to be. I think what we're seeing is, like, we look at Apple and we're seeing some of these CEOs that have some tremendous supply chain background. So Apple, Tim Cook the reason he's in that role is because he's mastered the just-in-time situation and how he worked through that through his growth there. So I think it's only, supply chain is not considered a niche business. I think it ties into everything, right? So it's becoming more broader, and that's why there's so much growth. I know within Apex, we've seen tremendous growth in our certifications. Universities see tremendous growth. I know it's very common to be the highest paid salary out of college in the business school. And it's for good reason, right? Because the more complex problems we can solve and we can teach people to solve, the more value they should get reimbursed accordingly. And so I think it's exciting.
What was just going to say, what you know, you see these next generation of leaders in supply chain. Do they look different to, say, what they looked like 20 years ago, 15 years ago? What's their genetic makeup like? What's their thinking like?
So I think that's a good question. It makes me think that, like, the origin of supply chain, right? It all started like in the military background, like if logistics wins and loses wars, right? So we've got a lot of strategic supply chains lineage from military for good reason. But I think we think about people are motivated a little differently, and the old supply chain leaders, I would indicate that they've been a little not as comfortable with technology as the future supply chain leaders have to be. So I think it's going to be pretty common that people that have a strong IT background might have a passion around business operations, and that's a great complement to move into supply chain. And one piece towards that, if we think about before, distribution companies were not as well known as they are today, and the power that distribution companies provide, because at the end of the day, there's so much variety of products. So on the manufacturing sense, most of the supply chain leaders would come from an engineering background. They move into supply chain. So I think it's just being a lot more comfortable with technology, and then also really knowing how to motivate employees. And the millennials are a lot different than the command and control. They like to have creative openness, and they like to kind of I've always had success with the best managers in my role, where they said, here's our end goal, find a way to get there. And then that builds that level of engagement where you could become a problem solver to get to the end goal without doing every step, cookie cutter approach.
So the genetic makeup is a bit different, isn't it? Than, as you said, the original, supply chain leaders, the ones of 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think what's interesting to think about is, I know, like, Microsoft Excel, right? It's common. Some people, there's different levels of understanding of Microsoft Excel. I know that I wouldn't be in the role that I'm in now or the past 10 years if I wasn't really strong in Microsoft Excel, right?
Yeah.
And I know that individuals coming up are going to have to be, Microsoft Excel is not the only thing, right? So how do we really understand all these different, technology and the whole analytics suite where, analytics are sitting on top these ERP system and pulling metrics as accordingly. And the beauty of it all is, with technology and everything going on, one has to understand the fundamentals of supply chain, and then those could really bring significant value. So, like, within Apex, we're the largest, we foster education supply chain globally. We're well recognized. And it's no matter how advanced the technology gets, in order to have someone really being able to effectively use that technology, they have to understand all the inputs and outputs. So that's why it's like knowing how, what it takes for the engine to work in a vehicle, right? It's kind of like, I see things that way. So, but yeah,
the fundamentals of supply chain, as you say, which is imperative. But what about, I mean, you talk about the silver lining of the situation that I guess it's putting supply chain on the map, certainly in the common lingo that even your person down the street knows what supply chain is, which might have changed from where we were 5 years ago, right? So the silver lining is that it's opened us up. Does that mean that it might attract different people from different diverse backgrounds, different type of thing? What will that do to the profession, you think?
Yeah, I think the great thing is right now, every company is getting it's becoming a lot more competitive, and customers are becoming a lot more, they want diverse products, right? So with that, it's demanding companies to think differently. And then they're going to start to focus more on, which they're already doing, getting the right people who could support those type of roles. So if we look at product variety across all different product lines, there's so many more options that we have as consumers, which is great. And then, the Amazon effect, everyone wants things in 2 days. So there's that benchmark that's being out there right now.
Well, and, if I could interrupt you briefly, I mean, probably the next generation, the digital natives, are people that have lived only in the Amazon world. And so for them, the expectation of their consumer behavior has set a certain bar of expectation that they have. So even if it's B2B, they're going to come into the marketplace, aren't they? Expecting something that you didn't when you were a kid, or when you were starting, that I didn't when I was started, and maybe even, right? Would you agree to that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you appreciate they don't know any different, right? The millennials, some of them don't know any different, but we all remember those EDI feeds and those that worked with a lot of paper and supply chain, and then we appreciate how far we come. So yeah, people are less patient for good reason, and it's all about results. So I think it's going to naturally get the right people in that role. I always love when I get this question a lot, and you might as well, that people always say, like, why did you choose supply chain? What is the interest behind it? And I always take that advantage of that question when it's being asked I get it from family members, I get it from a lot of people, because they're like, well, we understand marketing, finance, but why supply chain? And if you really break down what supply chain is, I think people see how tremendous it could have on a company's bottom line. And, it's critical to a company's operation. So it's not really a niche role. And I think the future is definitely bright. And I'm really happy to find something that I'm really passionate about, and that it's growing significantly, right? So
well, so the future leader has got technology on his or her side. They have critical thinking, creative, solutions focused. They're probably bringing to the table an understanding of e-commerce and an understanding of consumer, but the fundamentals of supply chain still are there, and that's still very important. What about the element of understanding the business? You talk about having an impact on the bottom line, but some companies, you could argue, will not survive this pandemic with, if they don't improve their supply chain. Supply chains will either, I guess businesses will either live or die by how good their supply chain is. So it's not just profit, is it? It's about, reputation. It's about the success of the business as a whole.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And I think when we think about supply chain, we'll talk about like demand planning, right? A lot of that activity can be automated. But when we think about the purchasing side of supply chain, companies need to partner with the right companies that really complement their strategic, order winners, right? So I think with the beauty of like purchasing, at one point it was considered back office work, like reactive mode. But there's so much content out there right now about how important partnerships with the right external partners is critical to a company's growth, right? So I think it's, you ask a really good question. Understanding the strategic, I always tell the students, and I always think this way, but really don't just understand how a company makes money, really understand what are their competitive advantages and their core competencies, and then how do you have that transmit through the entire supply chain? So when you can make really smart decisions on, should we go with a supplier that's more expensive but has a short lead time and better quality, or should we go with a supplier that's the converse, right? So it's all about breaking down product lines within companies and understanding what the strategic driver should be for each. And then that could help be the landscape or the backdrop for how the supply chain professional can really help connect the dots and saying, this is how I'm supporting our strategic efforts, right? I think another thing that I didn't bring up is it's real critical for people in supply chain to really be able to bridge how what they're doing impacts the financials, right? So like, income statement, balance sheet, and cash flows, and how they're really driving that value, because the people that have been moved up the ranks in supply chain have been able to do that very successfully. But I know that like supply chain can get really tactical and transactional focused. You could lose you can lose connections with the other functions, right? So the more that everyone could always take a step back and understand the big picture and share how they're doing is great. So
we talk quite a lot about or have talked quite a lot about attracting millennials and digital natives and young people to supply chain, but what about retaining them? What about keeping them, managing them, motivating them?
Yeah.
Can you give us some insight or some opinions on how you do that, how you integrate them into teams?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And every supply chain conference I've been to, and I go to a couple a year, there's always a breakout session about the talent gap, right? We don't have enough of the right leaders to meet our supply chain challenges. So the whole thing is what companies need to what professionals need to realize is there's some companies that do a great job from a development perspective, but really you have to be in the driver's seat on where you want to take your career. And that could be through certifications or it could be through continued learning. But, mentorship is really critical. So I've been really fortunate. I've had some really great bosses in my career that I still keep in touch with early in my career, and really building up someone that really wants to spend time and sees potential and wants you to grow is critical. So I think the best leaders are those that really feel proud when they can watch people develop, right? When they could watch junior professionals develop and grow. So those that are willing to give back and share is essential. So as far as retaining the talent, generally, so people are most interested in the highest salary, but I didn't become very interested in supply chain until I started working in the field and seeing how much opportunity there is to fix things, to fix problems. So I think those that are, it's always the ones that are natural problem solvers are the ones that are going to continue to stay down that path, and they're going to be engaged where they're kind of self-starters, So, but yeah, the talent gap's a big challenge for companies. Corporate culture is a big challenge, right? So we all know that companies have a big problem. There's too many meetings that happen, right? There's not enough action, maybe too much PowerPoint slides. And that can turn a lot of people away. I think that's a challenge that all companies have to realize, and they have to be able to make sure that they're really listening to their employees, because we all say that employees are the best assets, but the great companies are those that are really able to make sure that those employees that are passionate about something can focus on what they're passionate about,
And what about the fact, maybe old-fashioned management structures that create siloed environments? I think sometimes that might have an impact in terms of motivating people that are horizontal, creative thinkers to solve problems.
Exactly. So there's a term, entrepreneurial spirit, right? So
yeah.
How do we be really nimble and we get things done very quick, right? So that's where companies, they'll preach that they want to do that approach. But yeah, there's all these different layers of, all these authority levels that have like signatures, and it slows things down. And another thing that it does really openly is that it could give people job security, but it's all about the best companies are really able to break processes down. And they're really really trying to understand the value chain of how every individual process is being done. And then if you had time and duration around each, you can see where the bottlenecks and the opportunities are. But you're right on, where I think these very large companies, they're looking at how do these smaller companies, these startup companies, how are they handling things, and how do we kind of build that into our operations? And it's not easy, because we want to big companies want to standardize, and they want to have metrics that are understanding, but then they want to give that creative freedom to the employee. So the bridge is through having really good leadership at the middle manager level that are able to help. I think employees can't be afraid to try new things, and they have to be complimented when they fail. If they do fail, they learned, right? So it's all about, don't be afraid to do new things. So the best companies are those that allow the junior professionals to do things that are innovative, and that's how they grow and prosper.
So keeping this talent in is a combination of corporate culture. It's a combination of entrepreneurial spirit, which I guess is why a lot of big level companies, big Fortune 100 companies are very much aware of the fact that disruptive, younger, entrepreneurial companies are really shaking things up and really giving them a lot of competition, right? I mean, this is real.
Yeah.
This isn't a sort of make-believe game. This is real.
Yeah, and that's another great thing that makes me think about it. I've always reflected on the fact that these big companies, there's a competitor that they don't even know of yet, that's building some kind of software, and pretty soon they're going to be, regardless of the size, they're going to be able to compete directly on a certain type of product line. Another thing that's, going back to the digitization question, there's so much, those that can do, data scientist type work that ties into supply chain and really, streamline and automate metrics like dashboards. There's so much significance for that, because right now the best supply chain leaders, they want to have an understanding of how things are moving through the score model. And that's why we can take data and Excel, and we can flip things many different ways, but those that are able to do that, to code, is critical on that perspective as well.
Let's talk about data for a second. It seems like though data underpins absolutely everything. We're producing a lot of data. We're sitting on a lot of data. Do you think that the leader of tomorrow has an understanding and an appreciation? It's not just an understanding and a real appreciation of the value that data can bring to a business?
I think right now there's a lot. The challenge is there's so much data that companies have, and companies are starving for information. So they have all this data and they don't know what to do with it. Another thing that comes up is like sharing data between partners, right? People see that as proprietary, and they're afraid that if they share data, it might get misused, or might take away the, how the company makes money. I think there is an underestimate of data, if I were to generalize, because we don't know how critical it could have on a supply chain, right? So a lot of times people gloss over data, but and then you can, it's just all about understanding what are the key takeaways. And the whole thing with data is, if it's correct 60% of the time, you can go with the decision and do testing and prove out your thesis. But I think where people get spun up too much is they want the data to be precisely accurate, and they're wasting time. So there's, like with Six Sigma projects, those are heavily data driven. Six Sigma projects are really important, but I think where it slows things down is, sometimes the data element, which is critical, could require, analysis by paralysis or things along those lines. So I think over time, with future professionals will become a lot more aware of the importance of data. And I think it all starts with, I've always enjoyed, like, whenever you show metrics or charts to, coworkers and things like that, people always get excited about seeing trends. And a lot of times people believe it more than, being curious about, let me understand the inputs that make up those trends. So I think if you get to the conversation of the granular level with companies, it helps build that level of equal understanding of how that data was developed, so.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to supply chain leaders about hiring and retaining top level talent, the upcoming talent that's coming up, plus with regards to, I guess, building a resilient supply chain? I mean, as I'm asking that, that's a big loaded question, isn't it? So let's go first with the training, the hiring and retaining staff.
Yeah, that's great. So I think the first thing is, my first job out of college was at General Electric in Bloomington, Illinois, and I was impressed by the way they handled the hiring approach. And they said, we're just looking for talent, and we're going to find a role for you in supply chain. Initially, they saw me as I had a lot of internships, going out of college, and I was lucky to have a job out of college. But what they said is, we're going to work with you and we're going to make sure that we find something that a function that you want to work on and projects you want to work on. So I think at the initial stages, companies have to really be open to making sure that, this is a partnership. We're not just going to give you an assignment and just, so how do they build that level of trust early? And then also, like, competitive salary is critical. But the other piece that I think the great companies are getting it is the bonus structure. So at the end of the day, to empower employees, you want them to be really understanding of, they want to be able to influence their bonus, right? So, return on net assets, and they can say, well, if I directly drive inventory reduction down, I can improve return on net assets. So things like that, and then on the purchasing side, it's all about, cost out, right? So if you can drive cost out of the supply chain, I think companies are doing a disservice because they have this flat salary. And when the professionals are really doing great things, they're not rewarding them for that, right? So within purchasing, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to drive cost out of the supply chain, and there needs to be more of a flexibility of a payment structures that's related to that. But with that, spinning the data and making sure that people understand that it's there's a big difference between cost avoidance and cost reduction. Avoidance is like, we thought it happened and we made it happen, but sometimes companies use the two directly and they're completely different, So I think, real quick, talent structure, be creative, openly to the professional. Just find people that have the right values, and then you'll find a home for them. And then bonus structure is critical. And then also make sure that they start, right now, within a couple of years, people are they're going to new companies. And in supply chain, it's great. There's a tremendous amount of opportunities out there. We're in a fortunate time. But the great companies are really able to not be overconfident that all this talent is directly going to always come to their company, because we have things now like Glassdoor, right? Very transparent on how companies' cultures are. And individuals are looking at that, and professionals are having a lot more awareness about what's going to happen when they work at a company, what to expect, So, that's a exciting thing that's going on the talent side. And then, go ahead.
And then I was just gonna say, and then insofar as, I realized that the question was a big one. It's almost like a whole topic on its own. I think, let me just change my question a little bit. In terms of digital transformation, are there any kinds of technologies that are out there that are exciting to you right now? And that's it, that are exciting to you right now that you think will help with digital transformation?
So technology that I see is exciting. I think anything that's open source, there's a lot of, cloud-based demand planning, things that are connected, so with the challenge, like with every company wants to claim they have an ERP system that's fully connected. And the truth of the matter is most companies don't, right? And then when you look at SAP, for instance, it doesn't really do a great job of like network optimization from a demand planning perspective. So a lot of companies are looking to identify more of a strategic software that can kind of bridge that gap. The challenge that happens when you put all these softwares together is the interface gets broken between the two, right? Or between the three. So, it's interesting when we look at technology. I mean, there's, like there's a big movement on, Kinaxis, rapid, I think it's rapid deployment, and like, S&OP companies are trying to find ways to automate, S&OP. But at the end of the day, I think technology is not it's all about, is it a process challenge or is it a technology constraint? And then how do we bridge those two together? So, SAP's moving to HANA. There'll be a lot of activity around that. And I think it's just the old ERP way of Oracle and SAP are going to have a bunch of niche software. And I think those that win in that space are really having software that can fully connect, that could become like demand driven. So, what amazes me in my experience in supply chain, it's like all these companies have the same problems, the same challenges, regardless of the industry. And a lot of times it's pretty basic. It's right. How does that workflow get scheduled and get prioritized between the purchasing team and between the planning, and how do we make sure that our metrics roll up accordingly, right? So the great thing with, I think there's so much movement in software about analytics, right? For good reason. So Tableau, Spotfire, things like that. Those are going to continue to grow and become important. It's just a matter of understanding the whole landscape of what's all the technology that's out there and how we can fully utilize it. I think it's a crowded space though, because a lot of companies are trying to sell this silver bullet on, hey, we have the software to fix everything. You can't automate S&OP, right? You're never gonna be able to automate sales and operations planning. So I think it's just a matter of how do the best companies are able to find this technology and leverage it, right? So what I find interesting is, like, we think about Tesla, right? We all know Tesla is a great car, electric vehicle. They have all this excitement around them. From a supply chain perspective, they built their own ERP system because it's made up of software engineers. Another thing they did, if you look at the way they deliver vehicles to the customer, it's more of a pull system than they don't have dealerships, right? So Tesla's doing great things from a supply chain perspective that are not as well recognized, right? So,
right.
there's, I think.
So I guess just question the norm, not look at the exact, the old projects of old. I mean, if you think about an ERP implementation back in the day, making a decision on something that could be like a whole 4-year project, couldn't it? So with the pace of change the way that it is, and with technology changing and evolving so quickly, that kind of decision making is not feasible anymore, is it?
Yeah. Another one that's real popular is it's a company called PTC out of Boston, and they're supposed to be the leaders in the Internet of Things, and they have all this end-to-end technology that's trying to really leverage that. So I think there's going to be a lot more companies that are going to be moving in that direction. But yeah, it's exciting times. It's all about, we want to solve problems, and how do we use technology to solve those problems.
So I guess like maybe sort of like a parting question to you is, what opportunities, again, not to downplay any of the horrible things that are going on in this world with the pandemic, but what opportunities do you think that the pandemic can bring to supply chain professionals?
As far as opportunities, I think during this time where we're working from home, the professionals should be making sure that they're sharpening their sword, right? They're really learning about what else is out there. And what I always tell my students is, these big, large companies, they don't have everything figured out, and they really need help, and they need innovation. They need creative ideas that come from the ground up, that get proven out. So I think where what people should be thinking about is, okay, my job, is this, but how does it really fit in the big picture? And how do I continue to grow in that level of understanding, so I can become a better professional? So, being very innovative, trying new things. There's so much, it's amazing. There's so much content at our fingertips. We can really become an expert in anything, right? Through online learning and things like that. So,
so sharpen the saw, right? That's basically, I mean, right now, the opportunity is we're all working from home. So we've got more time to really look at, ways to improve things. You also talked about how supply chain being elevated to being common parlance, to being on the minds of everybody, gives us the opportunity to shine a light on the profession, and therefore maybe hire different diverse talent, etc. Would that be something else that you would agree to?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we think about the rock stars at companies, right? All companies are revenue driven, right? If you can close that deal with the customer, and you can become that, really, savvy salesperson, and you get a lot of respect and attention for good reason, right? You're bringing in revenue into the company. But I think where those, the future rock stars, I think, are really going to be a lot more focused on supply chain. And we look at, you can create this analogy to sports, right? So, my passion is soccer, right? We always look at, those who can score the most goals as the superstar. But in reality, those that understand the game, and they can understand how things fit together in order to make that possible, are the ones that enable companies to really prosper and grow. Because no matter how much work is being awarded to a company, it's all about execution. And how do you execute work that could support the customer, at the lowest cost possible to meet the quality? So I think it's all this back office type work where it's not getting a lot of attention in the past. It's going to get a lot more attention, because going back to the statement that it's so competitive right now in all different industries, it's really important for companies to realize how we can do things differently. and how do we embrace that talent, and then embrace digitization to really make sure that everything can, move in the right direction. So.
Well, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Vince. I really appreciate you taking the time to come join us on Fin TV and chat with us about your views on the profession, your views on what's going on in the world. And I'm sure we'll see you again in another episode.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks a lot. I'm really happy to, be a part of this. So I really look forward to, staying in touch with your organization and helping where I can. So.
Thank you.